5 men went out for a basketball game. They never came home. Their car was found deep in the mountains, far from where they were supposed to be. 4 of them were eventually discovered. 1 was never found at all. But the detail that turns this from a tragedy into a mystery is where at least one of them died, inside a shelter, with heat, with food, enough to survive for months. And yet, he starved. This is the story of the Yuba County Five, and it begins with a man who almost crossed paths with them and didn't know it. Joseph Shones was driving through the Plumas National Forest on a winter evening. He was scouting back roads, hoping to bring his family back the next day. The weather turned against him. By late afternoon, his car became stuck in the snow, miles from help. As he stepped out to try and push it free, his body gave out. Shones suffered a heart attack, alone on a mountain road in the cold. He dragged himself back into the car, left the engine running, and waited. For hours. Sometime later, he saw headlights coming from the opposite direction, then silhouettes, a woman, a baby, and several men walking together, talking as they moved. Shones stumbled out of his car and began calling for help. The headlights went dark. The voices stopped. Whoever they were, they never came closer. Hours passed. Later that night, Shones saw flashlights moving in the distance. Again, he called out. Again, no one responded. Eventually, his car ran out of gas. By then, he felt strong enough to walk. He began an 8-mile trek toward a mountain lodge. Along the way, he passed a parked vehicle, a 1969 Mercury Montego. It looked ordinary, unoccupied. At the time, it meant nothing to him. He reached the lodge the next morning and received medical treatment. His night was over. What he didn't know was that during his worst hours, while he waited in the dark, he had been closer to the answer than anyone else. Because that car belonged to 5 men who had vanished, and the decisions they made after leaving it would never be fully understood. They were known as the Boys, 5 friends from Yuba City, California, all in their 20s and 30s, all living with their parents, all expected home that night. On February 24th, 1978, they planned something simple, a road trip to Chico, a college basketball game. Jack Madruga was driving. His car was his Preda turquoise 1969 Mercury Montego. With him were William Sterling, Jack Hoot, Theodore Wyha, and Gary Mathias. They played together on a basketball team for adults with developmental challenges, the Gateway Gators. This night mattered to them. They had a game of their own the next morning. Their uniforms were already laid out at home. They weren't planning to stay out late. The game ended around 10 p.m. Their team won. They celebrated the only way they knew how, a stop at a small convenience store. They bought snack spies, candy bars, soda, milk, nothing unusual. The clerk would later remember them as the last customer she saw that night. Then they got back in the car. This is the last confirmed moment when all 5 men were together. From Chico, the route home was simple. South on Highway 99, back to Yuba City. But that's not the road they took. Instead of turning south, the Mercury headed east, toward the mountains, toward roads none of them needed to be on. Just before reaching Oroville, the car turned onto the Oroville-Quincy Highway, a dark, winding road that climbs into the Plumas National Forest, a road that leads away from everything familiar. Why they turned there has never been definitively explained. Some believe they were heading to visit a friend. Others think they missed a turn and kept driving. But what matters is this: they kept going, higher, colder, until the pavement ended, and the snow began. At some point, the Mercury became stuck in a snowdrift, not crashed, not damaged, simply immobilized. And this is where the night truly goes wrong, because instead of staying with the car, instead of waiting for daylight, all 5 men got out and walked into the darkness. The car was found days later, abandoned on a remote forest road, unlocked. The driver's window rolled down. Inside, everything was normal. Candy wrappers on the seats, empty soda bottles, a quarter tank of gas still in the tank. The mercury wasn't damaged, not by rocks, not by trees, not by the road that should have torn it apart. It wasn't even stuck anymore, which raised the first impossible question. If the car could be moved, why was it left there? Jack Madruga was known to be cautious, almost obsessive about his car. He didn't let anyone else drive it. He didn't leave windows open. And yet, that night, his window was down, his keys were gone, and 5 men had walked away from it. There were no footprints clearly leading in one direction, no signs of a struggle, no indication they were being chased. Just a silent vehicle resting in the snow, as if they had all agreed to leave. But there was something else. Someone else had been in the area that night. A man named Joseph Shons. He had been driving the same mountain roads. His car got stuck too. And while stranded in the cold, suffering from a heart attack, he saw something. Headlights in the distance, 2 sets, and figures moving between them. A group of people, possibly 5 men, possibly a woman and a child. Shans called out for help. Each time he did, the lights went out, the voices stopped. No one answered. Later, he would question his own memory. He was sick, in pain, possibly hallucinating. But his story planted a seed, because if those were the boys, they saw him and they didn't respond. When police learned the men were missing, they launched a search. But winter had other plans. Snowstorms swept through the mountains. Visibility dropped. Rescue teams were nearly lost themselves. After several days, the search was called off. The mountains went quiet again, and 5 men were left somewhere out there, alone. 4 months later, the snow finally gave up its hold, and what it revealed made everything worse. A group of motorcyclists rode into a remote campground near Bucks Lake. There, tucked deep in the forest, sat an abandoned Forest Service trailer. One of its windows was broken. Inside, the smell told them something was wrong. They found a body. It was Theodore Wyatt. He was wrapped tightly in sheets, lying on a bed. He had lost nearly half his body weight. His beard was long. His feet were severely frostbitten. He hadn't died quickly. Investigators concluded he likely survived for weeks, possibly months. This alone was disturbing, but what surrounded him was inexplicable. The trailer contained food, enough canned rations to feed 5 grown men for months, a propane tank, heat sources, matches, blankets, everything required to survive the winter, most of it untouched. The cans hadn't been opened properly. They were torn open by hand, as if whoever did it didn't know how to use the tools nearby. No effort had been made to cover the broken window. Cold air would have poured in every night. Wyatt didn't freeze because he lacked shelter. He froze because something prevented him from using it. And then there was distance. This trailer was nearly 20 miles from the abandoned car, through mountainous terrain, in winter, which meant at least some of them had walked that far, alive, together. The discovery reignited the search, and within days, more answers surfaced. But each one raised new questions, because not all of them made it to the trailer, and not all of them left it alive. Not far from the trailer, search teams made another discovery. 2 more bodies, William Sterling and Jack Madruga. They were found miles apart from the trailer, closer to the abandoned car. Sterling's remains were scattered. Time and animals had taken their toll. Madruga's body was found with something chilling still in his pocket, his car keys, which meant one thing. They didn't lose the car, they left it. Somewhere between the car and the trailer, the group split. At least 2 of them turned back, or couldn't go on. Cold, exhaustion, confusion. Investigators believed Sterling and Madruga succumbed to the elements while trying to return. That explanation almost worked. Almost, until they found Jack Hoot. His father discovered clothing belonging to him miles away from the others. Soon after, Hoot's remains were located nearby. This suggested something critical. Hoot had made it to the trailer, and then left, along with one other person, Gary Mathias. Mathias' shoes were found inside the trailer, his tennis shoes. He would not have left without them, which meant he had been there, lived there, survived there, and then disappeared. Search teams combed the surrounding area. They followed every possible route, every ravine, every trail. They found nothing, no body, no clothing, no remains. Gary Mathias was never found, which reopened every question investigators thought they had answered. If the group was simply lost, why did they separate? If they were panicked, why did some of them survive long enough to starve next to food? If this was an accident, why does one man vanish completely? The official conclusion leaned toward tragedy, a wrong turn, bad weather, poor decisions. But families weren't convinced, especially when they looked back at the beginning. At the moment the car was abandoned, at the decision that started everything. Why didn't they just go home? That's the question that refuses to go away. The route from the basketball game back to Yuba City was simple, familiar, well lit. They had driven it countless times, but instead of heading south, they turned east, away from home, up into the mountains, toward darkness, snow, and isolation. Some believe Gary Mathias convinced the group to take a detour. He had a friend who lived near Forbestown, a turnoff they may have missed. Once they were on the Oroville-Quincy highway, turning around wouldn't have been easy. The road was narrow, winding, dangerous at night, so they kept driving, believing another way out would appear. It didn't. Eventually, the car became stuck. But it wasn't hopeless. 5 grown men could have pushed it free. The engine still worked. There was gas. Nothing was broken. And yet, they chose to leave. They didn't try to sleep in the car. They didn't stay together. They didn't turn back toward lights or civilization. They walked forward, into deeper wilderness. Some believe they thought help was nearby, a lodge, a ranger station, something just over the next ridge. Others believe something scared them, something on the road, something they didn't understand. Joseph Sean's story comes back here. The figures he saw, the headlights that went dark, the silence that followed. If the boys encountered someone else that night, someone threatening, someone armed, someone who told them to keep moving, that could explain everything. Why they left the car, why they didn't respond to calls for help, why they walked miles into the forest without supplies. But there's no proof. Only a chain of decisions that don't align with who they were. Cautious, routine-driven, dependable. Men who followed rules. Men who trusted structure. Men who were terrified of being late. Yet that night, they broke every pattern and paid for it, or were forced to, which leads to the final truth of this case. No matter which explanation you choose, something doesn't fit. Every explanation depends on one assumption, that these men were acting freely, but the evidence doesn't fully support that. They didn't behave like people who were simply lost. They behaved like people who were following something, or someone. They walked in a straight, purposeful direction. They ignored shelter, ignored food, ignored warmth, even when survival was within reach. At the trailer, help was there, heat was there, enough food to last months was there, and still they died. Not all at once, not in panic, but slowly, deliberately, as if they didn't understand how to save themselves, or were waiting for something that never came. Gary Mathias is the key. He had survived worse conditions before. He knew the area better than the others. He understood danger, and yet he vanished. No body, no trace. If he left to get help, he never made it back. If he was taken, no one saw it happen. If he wandered off, nothing remains. And without him, the story can't close. So we're left with only fragments. A car that could still run. A shelter that could still save. Food that went untouched. A witness who may or may not have seen them. And 5 men who disappeared into a place that swallowed the truth with them. This wasn't just a case of being lost. It was a breakdown of logic, of safety, of certainty. And that's why it still matters. Because somewhere between the car and the trailer, between the road and the forest, something happened. Something that forced 5 men to walk into the cold and never come back the same. And until we know what that was, the mystery of the Yuba County Five remains exactly where it's always been, unfinished. The official record calls it an accident, a tragic chain of poor decisions, a wrong turn made worse by weather and inexperience. But accidents don't usually leave this many contradictions behind. They don't explain why 5 men abandoned a working car, why they ignored lights and voices, why they walked past survival and chose exposure instead, why one of them vanished completely. If this was simply nature doing what nature does, then the evidence wouldn't feel so deliberate, so precise, so wrong. The truth is, this case doesn't end with answers. It ends with a question that no investigation ever solved. What made them leave the car? Because once they did, everything else was inevitable. And until that moment is explained, the Yuba County Five aren't just victims of the cold. They're witnesses to something we were never meant to see. They didn't die because they were trapped. They died because they kept moving. That's the part that changes everything. Everywhere they went, safety followed close behind them. A car that still worked. A road that led back home. A trailer filled with food, heat, and shelter. At no point were they truly out of options. They were out of understanding. Whatever happened that night didn't just mislead them. It overrode instinct. It broke routines. It made 5 men abandon certainty for the unknown. And once that happened, the forest didn't need to do anything else. It simply waited. So here's the question that never went away. Not where they died, not how, but why they walked past everything that could have saved them. Why no one turned back? Why no one stayed? Why survival was always just within reach, and never taken? If you believe it was confusion, you have to explain the distance. If you believe it was panic, you have to explain the order. If you believe it was accident, you have to explain Gary Mathias. One explanation has to account for all of it. Until then, this isn't a solved case. It's a decision frozen in time. And whatever forced that decision was never found. Somewhere out there, the truth still exists. Not in files, not in reports, but in the space between the car and the trailer. Between the moment they chose to leave and the moment they realized they shouldn't have. That space is only a few miles wide, but it has swallowed answers for nearly 50 years. 5 men entered it. Only 4 were found, and one never came back at all, until that final absence is explained. The Yuba County Five remain lost, not to the forest, but to the moment everything went wrong.